Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second Lunch and Learn webinar series of 2025. Today, we will talk about the ADA's 35th anniversary and your rights as a person with a disability under the ADA. Before we dive in, I want to share that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our YouTube page by next week. As always, we'll have time at the end of our presentation for Q&A, and questions will be managed in the meeting chat. If you need to come off mute for any reason to ask your question, use the raise hand feature in Zoom, but if you can, please use the chat. My name is Savannah Bradley. I am the Community Outreach and Programs Manager with the Pacific ADA Center, and I am joined here today by Jan Garrett. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Savannah. Good day, everyone. My name is Jan Garrett, and I'm the Deputy Director of ADA Programs for the Pacific ADA Center, and excited to be here to celebrate the ADA 35th anniversary.
All right. So to kick us off today, I want to invite you all to take a moment and reflect and share in the chat your thoughts about the ADA. So we're here, as Jan mentioned, for the ADA's 35th anniversary. And this is an important civil rights law, and it's something worth talking about, right? And we each bring our own perspective to that. So we wanted to hear from you. We'll start with the first question. It says, what are you celebrating about the ADA? So you can think about the progress that you've seen or that you've experienced, and this could be big or small, and drop your comments in the chat. So give everyone a minute to sort of reflect, put your comments in the chat. What are you celebrating about the ADA? What progress have you seen or experienced, big or small? So I see it gives people access. We're celebrating more accessible websites with an exclamation point. They've gotten easier to navigate and use. Celebrating all of the people who fought to have rights under the ADA and that the ADA exists.
Lots of great comments. It's great to see everyone's thoughts on this.
Yes, I see celebrating my Independence Day as a person with a disability. That is what July 26th means to me. Those with disabilities are being recognized and worthy of respect and accommodations if needed. I see someone shared, we in the Virgin Islands are celebrating it on both islands. We're celebrating solidarity because at this time, the bill is cutting so many disability resources. This is wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating and sharing how you're celebrating the ADA. I see comments around increased awareness of need for accommodations. People are protected and have legal recourse. There's opportunities that it's brought for people with disabilities, mobility with an exclamation mark, celebrating our rights and acknowledging people and that no one is left behind. The ADA and disability is easier to talk about now, someone put in the chat, and that we need the ADA more than ever. Okay, more inclusive data and AI. I am celebrating its presence. As a nurse, I remember what people had to go through before the ADA. Ongoing advocacy for everyone. This is great. There truly is so much to celebrate about the ADA. I'm going to move on to the second question because I see some of you have already. What do you wish to see in the future? What is a change that you're still hoping for? What's something that's still not quite where it needs to be?
I see full inclusion.
Someone says, I want to know how government programs may change and affect our rights. Real-time captioning for local news, more job opportunities, more inclusive transportation, leveraging AI resources for greater inclusivity, greater accessibility and awareness. I see expanding accessible workplace technology, greater understanding of its importance and that it's not a level playing field for all. Captions in theaters without having to use external devices, greater communication, addressing bias, intersectionality recognition, more education for professionals. I appreciate you all sharing these. It really shows that we've come a long way, that we have a lot to celebrate, but we still have a lot of work to do, right, in the disability community, as people with disabilities, as professionals in the field. So I appreciate you all taking a moment to share and reflect with us here in the chat. And so I'll keep this open if you'd like to continue sharing your thoughts. So bringing us back to sort of how we got to where we are in the ADA. So here we reflected, what we're celebrating, how much progress we've done. But before the ADA was passed in 1990, people with disabilities in the US still faced discrimination and exclusion in almost all areas of life. Many were institutionalized, often because there were no supports in the community to help them live independently. Segregation was very common, and so that was physical segregation, but also social, educational, and economic. Before the ADA, the government also supported harmful eugenics policies, so that included forced sterilization of people with disabilities. Public spaces, buildings, and transportation were very inaccessible. And so just imagine not being able to go to school or attend a job interview or even go to the grocery store because there are stairs that are creating a barrier or lack of accessible transit. And those who could access their workplaces still experience discrimination in things like hiring and in the employment area. The photo on the right-hand side of the screen was taken by Tom Allen. And so this picture shows activists that were fighting for disabilities rights. So one of the protester signs here says, access is a civil right. So these are some of the demonstrations that were really important in demanding the protections that led to the ADA. And so that brings us here to today. We're celebrating 35 years of the ADA on July 26th, so just 10 days from today. And for the past 35 years, the ADA has protected the civil rights of people with disabilities and has done this by affirming that people with disabilities deserve equal protection under the law. And it ensures that people with disabilities have equal opportunity to participate in community life. So that means to live, work, go to school, use public services, and really enjoy the same spaces as everyone else. So as we celebrate the 35th anniversary this year on July 26th, it's a chance for us to continue reflecting as we've started today on how far we've come and really how much more work we have to do to achieve full inclusion and access. All right, so defining what a disability is under the ADA. So the ADA uses a broad definition of disability, and it has three sections. So the first part of this definition is that a person with a disability has or is covered under the ADA if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And this would usually last at least 6 months. And when we talk about major life activities, we're talking about things like walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, cognitive functioning, concentrating, normal cell growth, and many more major life activities. There's a list of examples here on the right side of the screen. The second part of this definition is having a record or history of such an impairment. And then the third part of the definition is being regarded as or assumed to have such an impairment. So if someone assumes that you have a disability and you're discriminated against, you would be covered under the ADA. So in addition to the major life activities, these everyday activities that we talked about in this previous slide, like walking and seeing, the ADA also recognizes major bodily functions. So things like our immune system, digestive function, our bowel function. So, how your brain works, how you're digesting food, how your body processes hormones or regulates blood sugar. These are all included under the definition of a disability. And this is especially important for people with chronic health conditions like diabetes or epilepsy or autoimmune diseases or cancer. So these conditions aren't always visible, right? But they still can significantly impact a person's daily functioning. So that qualifies as a disability under the ADA. So it's a broad definition that really helps make sure that people with disabilities that are, apparent or non-apparent are protected from discrimination. So here's another way to understand who's covered under the ADA. So basically, you have a disability if your body or your brain works differently than most people. And so that would make it harder or impossible for you to do things like hear, see, speak, think, walk, or breathe. And then a reminder here that some disabilities are visible or apparent, but many of them are not. Okay. All right. And then, when we're thinking about disability, it's important to know that it doesn't exist in a vacuum and it touches every part of society and really every part of identity. So people with disabilities are part of really every community. So every age group, every racial and ethnic group, every religion, gender identity, and sexual orientation. So that means when we think about disability, we have to think about it in connection with other identities that people hold. So, disability is not a standalone experience, right? Someone who is both disabled and part of a racial minority group may face uh, discrimination and barriers in healthcare, employment, or how their disability is recognized or supported. So that's one example of how this might play out in everyday life. And then poverty is always a factor, no matter what combination of identities that a person holds. People with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty, and this is sometimes because of systemic barriers to work, healthcare, or education. All right, so the ADA has some requirements for the entities that are covered under the 5 titles. So the 5 titles under the ADA are employment. So this covers all aspects of the employment process. Title 2 is for state and local governments. Title 3 is public accommodations, which are private businesses or nonprofits that are open to the public. Title 4 covers telecommunications. And then Title 5 is miscellaneous. So this is a catch-all section of the ADA. It talks about how you enforce it and how it's related to other laws. So the entities under these 5 titles, so think your employers, state and local government offices, businesses, and nonprofits, they all have to provide reasonable accommodations to applicants and employees with disabilities, if they're in the employment area, for example. They have to all provide accessible locations for programs, provide accessible websites, provide effective communication. So this means providing communication aids and services for participants with hearing, speech, or vision disabilities. And they have to provide reasonable modifications to some policies and procedures if it's necessary. So that's a brief overview of the ADA and its 5 titles. Here, this brings us to Title One, so ADA and employment. This covers all state and local government employers. It also covers private employers that have 15 and more employees. So under Title One, it says that people with disabilities have to be treated the same as people without disabilities at all stages of work. So this means from the point of applying to jobs, to interviewing, to when you're being considered for promotions, or when you're having conversations about leave or absences. You must be treated the same and not be discriminated against. Also in the area of employment, employees can ask for reasonable accommodations to either apply for jobs or to do their jobs. And these are often small changes that really make a big difference to employees with disabilities. And so some examples of reasonable accommodations could be asking for a different or more flexible work schedule, job coaches to help learn your job, asking for equipment that helps you do your job better, having sign language interpreters, asking for leave for a disability or train a service animal, or even asking for modifications in your workstation if you need to move it to a different location.
Hi,
These are
Savannah. Sorry to interrupt, but I
yeah.
think you're one slide behind, maybe.
Oh,
I don't know.
oh my
Maybe.
gosh, you were right. Thank you. All
Okay.
right, so I think I'm on the slide of ADA and employment. Is that right?
Well, I think you're on reasonable accommodations eventually, but that's okay. We can just keep going. Uh,
Okay.
that's later.
Okay. So yes, ADA and employment, it covers state and local government employers and private employers with 15 and more employees. So it covers all aspects of the employment process. So that brings us to reasonable accommodation that employees can ask for to help do their job. One other thing that I'll add here, and apologies for the mix up here, is if you're looking for more ideas on what potential reasonable accommodations you can ask for at your work site, there is a resource called JAN, it's the Job Accommodation Network. And so you can look up what specific condition you might be experiencing, and then look for potential ideas for accommodations that you can ask for in the workplace. Okay, so other ADA rights. So that brings us to Title II of the ADA, so that's state and local government facilities. So this covers programs, services, and activities run by state and local governments. So things like city parks, public libraries, and public housing offices. So here, public entities have to provide completely accessible new buildings and facilities like parks, program accessibility for buildings and facilities that were built before the ADA. So when a government building is constructed, it has to meet current accessibility standards that include things like accessible entrances, restrooms, parking, and signage. For older buildings, those built before the ADA, cities and states don't necessarily have to renovate everything, but they do have to make sure that their programs are still accessible. And then websites and mobile apps, if a public service is offered online, it also has to be accessible to people who are using screen readers or other assistive technology. So really the goal here is to make sure that people with disabilities can fully participate in community life. Okay, and then public accommodation facilities. So here, Title III of the ADA. So this covers private businesses and nonprofits that are open to the public. So here it's going to be things like stores, restaurants, gyms, movie theaters, or private doctor's offices. So, just like the government buildings, any new construction after the ADA has to be fully accessible. Um, and there's no grandfathering for older businesses. If they were built before the ADA, they still have to remove barriers if it's considered readily accessible. So basically, if a business is open to the public, it must be physically and programmatically accessible to people with disabilities. Okay, we're going to move on to reasonable modifications, and I will pass the mic over to Jan.
Okay, thank you so much, Savannah. I appreciate that. So um, now we're going to move a little bit away from facilities and talk about other obligations that state and local governments and public accommodations have to adhere to under the ADA, have to comply with. And so public entities, otherwise known as state and local governments, and public accommodations have to make reasonable modifications to their policies, practices, and or procedures if that's necessary to prevent discrimination against people with disabilities. And there's just tons of examples of different reasonable modifications. So allowing food in a library for a patron with diabetes where food is usually not allowed could be a modification of that no food policy. Moving tables and chairs around in a restaurant to create an accessible route from the front to the back of the restaurant could be considered a reasonable modification. And giving a patient who has anxiety an early medical visit to avoid crowds could also be considered a reasonable modification of policy, practice, or procedure. Now, if you have a reasonable modification and it fundamentally alters, meaning it fundamentally completely changes the way that you operate your program, good, or service, you're not required to make that reasonable modification if it's fundamentally altering. But otherwise, yes, you do have to provide those reasonable modifications of policy, practice, and procedure. Next slide. So one example, a very common example of a reasonable modification is to modify a no pet policy to allow service animals to be with their handlers in public spaces where normally pets are not allowed. So generally, service animals can go anywhere their handlers can go, with very limited exceptions, like where food is prepared in a restaurant, although the animal can be with their handler in the part of the restaurant where you're dining or the part that has a bar. And then service animals are often restricted from infection control areas like operating rooms and intensive care units, things like that. But other than a very few limited examples, service animals, if they're truly a service animal, can go with their handlers wherever their handlers go. Next slide. So remember that a service dog, a service animal, is a dog, and only a dog. But you still may have to modify your policies, practices, and procedures, your no pet policy, to allow for a miniature horse, which are also covered in the ADA. So whatever animal you use, whether it's a miniature horse or a dog, that animal has to be individually trained to perform one or more tasks that are directly related to its handler's disability. So they have to do something that the handler needs because of their disability. And the tasks that the animal does have to be physical. They have to do something specific, but the handler doesn't necessarily have to have a physical disability. The handler's disability can be physical, mental, cognitive, sensory, any kind of different disability, as long as the animal is doing a physical task to assist them that is directly related to the handler's disability. It's important to understand that the handler can train their own animal. You don't have to have an animal trained at a professional service, although those do exist, the professional service animal training. And there is no certificate, collar, vest, etc., that's required. People can print those out from the internet, and often they pay for them, but they are literally not worth the paper that they're printed on. Next slide. So how would you know if a service animal is a service animal if you're not allowed to have that certificate or that vest? What you can do, and this is important for people to know this, people with disabilities as well, is that anywhere they go, people can ask them two questions. One, is the animal required because of a disability? If the answer is yes, which usually it is, you can ask what work or task has the animal been trained to perform. Those are the two questions you can ask to know if if an animal is a service animal. And that's all you can ask for. You can't ask for any kind of other proof. Don't ask about any more about the handler's disability or to see the task performed because it may not be time for that animal to perform that task. And don't ask these questions, these question one and question two, if it's really obvious that the animal is a service animal and is working with the person, the handler with a disability. Next slide. So it's really important that service animals always be under the control of their handler. They must be on a leash, harness, or tether unless the handler cannot hold the leash or tether because of their disability, or the leash or tether would interfere with the service animal being able to perform its work or tasks. But even without a leash or tether, the animal has to still be under strict control of their handler's voice or hand signals, whatever it is, the animal still needs to be under control, even if it is not leashed or tethered. It should not run around, it should not growl or bark, and it must be housebroken. That is part of being under control and being a legitimate service animal. Next slide. So, moving from service animals, and by the way, emotional support animals are not considered service animals in case, people have a question about that. If its only task is to provide emotional support, then it is not a service animal. To be a service animal, it has to do something physical to assist its handler. So moving from service animals over to effective communication, another thing that public accommodations and public entities, state and local government entities, have to do is to provide people who have vision, hearing, and or speech disabilities equal communication access to their goods, programs, and services. Next slide. So how do you do this? How do you provide this effective communication? Well, for one thing, you need to understand that the effective communication that you provide has to be as effective to people with those communication related disabilities as it is for people who don't have those communication related disabilities. And what you do to provide that effective communication is that you use communication or auxiliary aids and services to provide the effective communication. And in terms of which auxiliary aids or communication aids and services you use, it depends on what is being communicated, how long the communication is, how complicated the communication is, and most importantly, it depends on what the person tells you they need. How is it that communication can be effective for them? Next slide. So examples, yeah, that's next slide. Examples of auxiliary aids or communication aids and services can be a qualified sign language interpreter like we have on our webinar here today, a certified deaf interpreter who themselves is deaf but might be able to relay the conversation between a deaf person and an American Sign Language interpreter because maybe the communication is not as clear as the American Sign Language interpreter would need it to be able to communicate what is being said and heard by or understood by the deaf person. Also, real-time captioning for people who don't use sign language, but who may have lost their hearing or may be hard of hearing later in life. They may need to use real-time captioning, which can be remote. Again, we have captioning on this webinar, but it can also be in person for in-person meetings and conferences. Assistive listening devices can help a lot of people who are hard of hearing, and there are a variety of different types of assistive listening devices, and it depends on what kind of setting you have as to which type of device is going to be the best and what type works for the person. Then you can have telephone relay services that people can communicate with people over the phone to be able to do everything from order a pizza to make an appointment, to talk with their friends who may not be deaf or hard of hearing. You can exchange written notes for a very brief, very basic conversation, but in general, you should not rely on exchanging written notes for anything that's beyond maybe a few sentences. Um, and you can also provide things for people with vision disabilities like alternative format materials, like electronic documents, large print. You can provide Braille for some types of documents. And you can also provide qualified readers for people who have vision disabilities who may be qualified to read a particular document to that person. And on the screen, we have some examples of finger touching Braille and hands that spell out ASL on the slide. Next slide. So that's a little bit about what both public accommodations and public entities are supposed to do. But so if you feel like you have had your rights violated on the job, like in employment or in getting state or local government services or from a private business or a private nonprofit, what do you do? How is the ADA enforced? The first thing you can do, and we recommend kind of starting with this, is talk to the person about your experience. Talk to your employer, talk to the state or local government um, entity, or talk to the restaurant and tell them about your experience that you feel like was discriminatory, and ask for a change and ask for them to stop that discriminatory behavior or the way that discrimination is happening to you. I would always try that first, because you might be able to resolve the situation much more quickly by talking to the person initially. If that doesn't work, you can ask an advocate from an independent living center or a disability rights organization. And we have some resources at the end of this presentation about how to reach different centers for independent living or disability rights organizations. And you can ask them to help you advocate for your rights. You can also file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Justice, and you can file that for any kind of discrimination you may have experienced, even if it wasn't with some sort of entity that is covered by the Department of Justice, because the Justice Department will route that complaint to the right agency. But you can also file a complaint directly with other agencies like Department of Education for educational issues, Department of Transportation for transportation issues. So you can file directly with the different organization, or you can file with the Department of Justice, who will route the complaint over. You also, under the ADA, have the right to file a private lawsuit. With employment-based lawsuits, you do have to go through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or your state Civil Rights Department first and get a right to sue letter. But for Title II and Title III, you don't have to do that. You can file a private lawsuit initially, or you can do both, file a complaint and a private lawsuit, if that's what you choose to do. But we always recommend starting with asking the person to stop the discriminatory conduct or the discriminatory access violations and improve those, or to start with an advocate, that rather than moving toward the complaint or the lawsuit phase. But you obviously have those rights if you choose to, utilize them. Next slide. So Title V of the ADA also says that people with disabilities can ask for their rights. Remember, the ADA is a civil rights law. And if you're covered under the ADA as a person with a disability, you can ask for your rights under any part, any title of the ADA, without fear that someone will use that against you. So your employer cannot retaliate against you for asking for your rights in employment, and state and local governments and private businesses and nonprofits cannot retaliate against you for saying, hey, I think I was discriminated against here and I want the civil rights that the ADA gives me. So you, and also you have civil rights in telecommunications, such as access to the relay service or accessible 911 service. And so all of that, you should be able to request your civil rights and gain your civil rights without fear of being retaliated against by the employer, by the state and local government, or by that private business or nonprofit. Next slide. It's also important to know that public accommodations and government agencies cannot place a surcharge only on some people with disabilities or groups of people with disabilities to cover the cost of complying with the ADA. So examples could be charging a person who's deaf to contract for a sign language interpreter. You cannot charge that person for using the sign language interpreter. You cannot charge for fees to create Braille documents that may be charged by the entity that creates the Braille for the state or local government or for that private business or nonprofit. And you cannot charge something like a cleaning fee for service animals. Now, if a service animal actually does do damage to something, then you can charge the handler for that damage to like furniture or some other part of an area. But if it's just for like cleaning of extra fur or maybe cleaning up if the service animal has an accident, you cannot charge the service animal for that. Those are all considered surcharges, and you cannot charge people with disabilities for those. Other examples could be charging people more for an accessible hotel room because it's bigger. You cannot do that. So there's many examples of where you could have surcharges that are not acceptable and not allowed under the ADA. Next slide. So what is our future? What is the future of disability rights? What can we think about what's happening with the future of the ADA and other disability rights laws, and what are we looking at in terms of our future? And this has a picture of a number of people standing in front of a building, and there is a big banner, and it says disability rights are human rights. So all of us on this webinar probably know this, that the ADA is a civil rights law. All of us who are people with disabilities are humans, and our rights are human rights as well. Next slide. So where do we go next with the ADA? Where do we go next with civil rights laws? We need to advocate for disability rights. We need continued community education and awareness. So all of those entities need to be aware of what they need to do to comply with the ADA, and hopefully that will mean that they no longer discriminate against people with disabilities if they understand what they're supposed to do and comply. And that's really what the ADA centers are here for, is to promote understanding and awareness of the ADA and other disability rights laws, and to promote compliance that is voluntary compliance. So people don't have to receive complaints from a federal agency and don't have to be sued, because they actually understand the law better and understand how to comply with it. We also need to seek information on the government's actions on disabilities and maintain our awareness of what's happening out there with what the government is doing with regard to our disability civil rights and our benefits, etc. And so even though the ADA is 35 years old, there is still a lot of misunderstanding about it. And so really the ADA National Network and the Pacific ADA Center is here to provide that awareness and understanding so that there can be more compliance and just eliminating discrimination. Next slide. So we have provided some resources for you. The National Council on Independent Living, which can route you to your and that it has information from their advocacy monitor, and that can tell you what the Centers for Independent Living are advocating for. And they're advocating for many different things in the current day. And also to the National Disability Rights Network for your Center for Disability Rights Network that's in your state. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network that also is talking about policy and action that they're doing, and you'll want to follow them. And then the Job Accommodation Network that Savannah mentioned earlier that provides lots of good information about accommodations in the workplace and separates those out by different disabilities and different possible accommodations. So there are many other resources that we could have provided. This is just the beginning, but we encourage you all to contact us for more information, more resources. Next slide. So let's see if we have some questions and people can think about, and if they want to continue to post in the chat what they think the future of the ADA is and what they will do to make sure the ADA is there for future generations. But we'll start with questions.
Lots of questions and comments are in the chat. Start with the comment here. It says ADA accommodations doesn't necessarily cover the same rights as legal guardianship issues. So that was a comment that was dropped in the chat. First question, are faith-based organizations exempt?
In general, faith-based organizations are exempt from the ADA. There are a few exemptions. Some of those exemptions, I mean, in other words, there may be coverage by the ADA in certain employment situations where it's a non-ministerial employee, and maybe where they have a place of public accommodation that is located within the religious facility but is not run or operated by the religious facility, that would be covered by the ADA. And even religious facilities and buildings are covered by state law and state building codes often. So yes, in general, religious entities are exempt because of the separation between church and state in the Constitution, are exempt from ADA, but there could be some exceptions. So it's important to understand what is covered for those organizations and what is not covered in terms of the ADA.
Great. Next question, what questions can the business ask the service animal or perhaps their handler, it sounds like?
Yeah, I don't know that the service animal is going to tell you much, but what they can do is they can ask the handler the two questions that we mentioned earlier in the presentation. Is this animal needed because of a disability? If the answer is yes, then you can ask what task or work is the animal trained to do. Those are the only two questions, and that's how you will know if an animal is a service animal. You can also make sure that it is under control, because it does have to be under control in terms of its behavior and being housebroken as well. But those are the only two questions you can ask the handler about their animal to determine if it's a service animal.
This next question says, where can I get more on what practices need to be changed?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a broad question. I'm not exactly sure what kind of entity you might be from. There is a requirement for state and local governments to do what's called a self-evaluation, where they look at their policies, practices, and procedures and decide, do we have discriminatory policies, practices, and procedures that need to change? So that's part of the self-evaluation that they need to do. But private businesses and private nonprofits also need to look at that as well. Do they have the policies and procedures that may be intentionally or unintentionally discriminating against people with disabilities? So there are almost as many policies and procedures as I can name that might need to be changed or modified in order to give people with disabilities the ability to access your program, services, and activities as a state or local government, or your goods and services as a public accommodation, whether you're a private business or a private nonprofit. So there are so many different examples, and you may want to contact your regional ADA center at the information that we put in the chat, 1-800-949 4232, or email them to see, if you have specific questions about what policies and procedures you might need to change.
Okay, and a reminder that the presentation slides and the session recording will be made available next week. Next question. Carrying an EpiPen for someone with an anaphylactic allergy, would this be considered a task?
Um, Well, I mean, generally, the animal kind of has to actually do something physical as opposed to just carrying the EpiPen. Certainly, if it needed to bring you the EpiPen for you to be able to use it, that would be a physical task that I can think of that the animal would do. But if it's carrying it like in a backpack or something like that, I'm not sure whether that rises to the level of what would be considered a task that the animal has to do, as far as its physical task.
We have a couple of more service animal related questions. This first one says, if a dog bites an employee and the person claims they are a service animal, can the business ask them to leave?
Certainly, if even if an animal is doing a task for a handler, um, if that animal bites someone, then the animal is out of control, and you can ask the handler to remove the animal, because any animal, whether it's a service animal that does a task or not, that is out of control, should be removed, and the handler should do that. If they are, a legitimate handler, they should know that and they should do that, and then the handler could come back without the animal once the animal is excluded.
Okay, and this next question is related specifically to a miniature horse. So it says, um, I'd like to ask about the physical task that the horse needs to be trained to do. We have an individual who states a disability of limited walking due to 6 month pregnancy and wants to bring a service animal, a miniature horse, to sit on. This request was after we responded to her request for us to provide a wheelchair and advised that we do not provide personal equipment like a wheelchair. Is the miniature horse's trained task include allowing their handler to sit on them? And is this directly related to limited walking?
Wow, that's a very fact-specific question. And the first thing that occurs to me, pregnancy in and of itself is not a disability. Certain pregnancy-related conditions could be considered a disability. Being able to sit on a service animal, again, the animal's not doing a really specific task for you. Now, it could be helping you balance. There are people who use service animals to balance and hold on to a harness or tether to help them do that. So that is a task that an animal can do, and certainly guide dogs can provide navigation assistance for people with vision disabilities. But this is such a fact-specific question, and so fact-specific in terms of whether the person even has a disability to begin with. I think the better thing is for you to contact your regional ADA center and discuss this or email about this with them, is what I would suggest.
Thank you, Jan. We have a comment. It says captions can help with processing delays too.
Ab-
And the next question, it says, would an ABA, applied behavioral analyst, be part of services?
would an applied behavioral analyst be part of services?
Hmm. And I think you might be referring to perhaps employment accommodations. I'm not quite sure what part of
Yeah, that
transportation.
question is not quite clear to me, and it really depends on the situation of where the behavioral analyst is and what the behavioral analyst does and whether or not they're allowed to be there. All of that. So again, this is a question that you should talk to your regional ADA center about. It's a very fact-specific question.
Okay, so this one says, we have had individuals request computers with applications. Can we offer to provide content in a manner that is consistent with how they normally communicate with others?
Could you please read that one again?
Absolutely. So this person has had individual requests for computers with applications. And they want to know if they can offer to provide content in a manner that is consistent with how they normally communicate with others.
Okay. Well, what I think I'm understanding is that you basically just want to provide the communication to this person that you would normally provide to anybody, whether or not they have a disability. And the truth is that if this person has a vision, hearing, or speech disability, you need to provide effective communication. So the computer applications may be necessary for somebody with one of those disabilities. And keep in mind that the ADA, although it is providing equal opportunities, you may have to do something above and beyond just providing an equivalent service or experience in order for that person to be able to take advantage of effective communication or other ways of being able to access a state or local government, a private public accommodation, or employment. So don't just think of it as, oh, we're just going to make it so that it's the same as everybody else. The truth is, the ADA may indeed require you to go above and beyond what communication you provide to everyone else.
Okay, and we have a comment. This is related to filing a complaint. It says it's important to be a self advocate, and it's best to try to resolve the issue at the lowest possible level. Reality is that filing a complaint can be a long, drawn out, expensive process.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And that's why I suggested that earlier. Absolutely.
Let's see. Can the DOJ complaint be made anonymously?
Honestly, I I don't know that that's possible. I don't know the answer specifically to that question, but I'm not sure why you would want to make it anonymous. I mean, there could be a variety of reasons, but I think they require you to put in your contact information. But because I'm not at DOJ, I don't accept the DOJ complaints. That is a question that you would need to ask DOJ directly.
This next question is about purchasing a service animal or taking a service animal out for training for a person with a disability. They're asking for resources and wondering if this is state specific, and this person is located in Kansas.
Generally, the ADA does not refer to service animals in training at all, but there are many state laws that allow service animals in training to be able to come into public places. It would absolutely depend on your state law. Because you're in Kansas, I would refer you to talk to the Region 7 ADA Center that serves Kansas. And again, you can contact them 1-800-949-4232 if you have a Kansas based area code telephone. So contact them and ask them whether or not Kansas allows service animals in training.
Okay.
We might have time for one or two other questions.
All right, just scrolling through the chat here. Some of these are very specific, so I would encourage you to either contact us directly or the ADA Center in your region. Um,
And if there are any questions that you would like to answer directly, Savannah, please feel free to do that.
Okay, so one young adult asked if an animal has been trained to respond to the handler's panic attacks. Does this qualify as a service animal under the ADA? And I would say yes, because the service animal is there for to support a disability, and it's trained to do a task. So it's responding to their handler's panic attack.
Yeah, if there's a specific task that it does to respond to it. Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Okay. Could you repeat which buildings are okay to be grandfathered in? I thought it was okay for government buildings built before the ADA to not be accessible. but it sounds like businesses that are open to the public need to renovate or follow the ADA, even if they were built before.
Do you want me to answer that one, Savannah?
Uh, I'm going to There is no grandfathering in for buildings. If they were built before the ADA, they are required to make their programs or services accessible. So either by providing ramps or making other changes within the building that makes it accessible for people to access these public services and programs. So
Or moving the program to an accessible location, or there's lots of ways to provide program access, and that's what state and local governments have to do. And then private businesses, that was an excellent answer, Savannah. Businesses have to do what's called readily achievable barrier removal for any kind of barriers, accessibility barriers that exist within their buildings and facilities. So basically, they have to do what they can and what's financially feasible for them to do to remove those barriers. So it's a little bit different standard between state and local governments and public accommodations, but basically, yes, they still have to remove accessibility barriers or provide access to their goods, services, and programs.
I see a lot of appreciation in the chat for this Q&A session. Let's see, we have, is there ADA or state money available to employers to assist with providing work accommodations?
Well, it's a good question to ask. There are some tax credits and tax deductions that are available. And again, if you contact your regional ADA center, we can route you to those tax information, and that can be for helping employers, but as well as just private businesses to help private businesses to actually remove barriers. They can get some tax deductions and tax credits for removing communication and physical barriers. So there's definitely employment tax information as well as physical and communication tax credit and deduction information.
There's a comment in the chat. It says, I'm a volunteer puppy raiser for a national organization called Canine Companions. And it sounds like they can answer service dog questions as well for anyone looking for an organization for service animals. And then let's see, we can provide a certificate of attendance for this webinar.
And I do see maybe what we should do is um, let Kara ask their question last here before we wrap up, because Kara, I know you had your hand up for a while. Can you unmute?
Okay. Kara, we will be allowing you to unmute. One moment, please. Okay, you can unmute your microphone and ask your question. If you need to use the keyboard to unmute, you can use Alt+A, and that should allow you to unmute your microphone.
Okay, sorry, Kara. I don't think we're being able to hear you, and it looks like you are still muted. So maybe you accidentally raised your hand. I don't know, but um, at any rate, I think we're at about 2 minutes till the webinar is completed. Is there a very last comment or question we can put out there, Savannah?
Last question is how to become an ADA coordinator, and this is specifically for Hawaii.
Yeah, there are you may need to apply for an ADA coordinator position, and there are certificates that are available. There's a certification program which is not required by the ADA, but can help you. And your ADA center, if you're in Hawaii, would be us at the Pacific ADA Center. So feel free to contact us, and we can give you more information. And anybody on the webinar can go to their ADA center to find out more about the ADA coordinator training certification program.
I want to thank everyone for all of your insightful questions. I recognize that we didn't get to all of them today. I want to leave you with our contact information so that you can either call us or email us. and send us your question directly if you are in our region, or we can help you find the ADA Regional Center that is closest to you. Subscribe to our newsletter to learn more about upcoming events and resources that we have to share. If you're interested in continuing to celebrate the ADA's 35th anniversary, we do have a list of events that are happening for the month of July, and some go into August. You can go to our website, adapacific.org, for more information. After today's webinar, you will get an email where you'll have instructions on how to get your certificate of attendance. I saw a couple questions in the chat about that. And then before you go today, please complete an evaluation. Gabe has put our evaluation link in the chat. That will also be in the follow-up email that he sends you, along with the slides. And then again, our webinar recording will be on our YouTube page by next week. But I want to thank everyone again for being here today, and thank you for all of the great questions. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, thank you so much. And please do fill out your evaluation. We'd love to have your feedback.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.